The global energy market disruptions triggered by Venezuela's isolation revealed how tightly politics and fuel are intertwined, because oil does not simply disappear when a producer is sanctioned. It moves, it disguises itself, it finds new routes, and in doing so, it reshapes prices, alliances, and assumptions. And when Venezuelan crude was pushed out of traditional Western markets, the immediate narrative suggested scarcity and collapse. But what followed instead was rerouting on a scale that exposed the limits of enforcement in a globalized system, where tankers can switch flags, cargoes can be blended, shipping data can go dark, and buyers can justify transactions through intermediaries, creating a shadow flow that kept barrels moving even as official statistics pretended otherwise. And this mattered because Venezuelan oil, heavy and difficult to refine, was once deeply integrated into specific refinery systems, particularly in the United States, and removing it did not eliminate demand. It merely forced refiners to seek alternatives, often at higher cost, while Venezuelan producers sold at deep discounts elsewhere, absorbing losses but maintaining volume, and this discounting became a signal to the market, pulling in buyers willing to trade compliance for price advantage, which in turn distorted benchmarks and undercut the idea that sanctions cleanly separate legal from illegal supply, because energy markets respond to incentives faster than to declarations, and as these flows adjusted, the ripple effects reached far beyond Venezuela, contributing to volatility that fed inflationary pressure globally, especially during periods of already tight supply, meaning consumers in distant countries paid part of the price for a policy framed as targeted and contained, and the longer this persisted, the more normalized these rerouted pathways became, as shipping firms, insurers, and traders developed expertise in navigating gray zones, turning exception into routine. And in parallel, major energy players outside the Western orbit expanded their role, absorbing discounted crude, refining it, re-exporting products, and embedding Venezuelan supply into broader networks that made origin increasingly opaque, blurring accountability while preserving continuity. And this process did not just keep oil moving, it redistributed leverage, because dependence shifted away from traditional hubs toward alternative centers of trade, accelerating a fragmentation of the energy order that had been quietly underway for years. And for the United States, this presented a paradox, because while sanctions aimed to weaponize market access, the market responded by innovating around the weapon, reducing its long-term potency, and in some cases strengthening competitors who benefited from arbitrage and strategic positioning. And domestically, the loss of Venezuelan supply forced adjustments that highlighted the cost of politicized energy policy, as refineries optimized for certain grades faced higher input costs, supply chains grew longer, and price sensitivity increased, all while policymakers maintained the fiction that these disruptions were external and unavoidable, rather than the foreseeable outcome of removing a key producer from an interconnected system. And globally, the message was absorbed that energy security increasingly depends not on alignment, but on flexibility, encouraging states to diversify suppliers, invest in alternative payment systems, and hedge against political risk, which further diluted the influence of any single actor. And over time, this contributed to a more segmented market, less transparent, more transactional, where trust is replaced by redundancy and compliance is negotiated rather than assumed. And this segmentation has consequences, because fragmented markets are less efficient, more volatile, and more prone to sudden shocks, meaning the costs of rerouting are not limited to the sanctioned country, but are socialized across the system. And yet, despite these inefficiencies, the system holds, because oil remains indispensable and demand remains persistent, creating a baseline resilience that sanctions alone cannot erase. And as crises elsewhere compounded these dynamics, from conflicts to supply cuts, the Venezuelan case became a template, demonstrating how sanctioned oil can re-enter the market indirectly, cushioning shortages while complicating accountability, and in doing so, it challenged the central assumption of economic statecraft that control over formal channels equates to control over outcomes, when in reality, energy markets operate through a mix of formal rules and informal practices that adapt rapidly to constraint, and the end result was not a clean break, but a reconfiguration, where Venezuelan oil continued to circulate, prices absorbed the friction, and the global market emerged more complex and less predictable, illustrating that when energy is politicized at scale, the disruption does not stop at the border of the target. It radiates outward, reshaping flows, redistributing power, and quietly rewriting the rules of how oil moves in a world where demand refuses to wait for diplomacy.